Welcome, Johnny Walker. Johnny
Good morning.
Walker is a Camino expert, and he's come
Wow.
from a different world, doing the journey from the business world to becoming a Camino expert, writing several books, including several guidebooks on the Camino, and he is very active on several Camino forums. At least in the English language world, I would describe him as one of the leading Camino experts. Uh, Johnny, can you tell us a bit about your journey from an entirely different world to where you are now, living in Santiago, only a few steps, as you say, from the cathedral?
Good morning, Rhino, and welcome to Santiago on this rainy morning. We've had, I don't know, almost 3 weeks of sunshine, and then yesterday the heavens opened, and it's like monsoon weather here in Santiago. But at least at the moment, there are very few pilgrims getting wet. And of course, Santiago is the end of the journey for them, as it was for me in 2007 when I walked my first Camino. My my uh, my teenage years were spent on the hills of Scotland, walking in the mountains, and I did a bit of rock climbing, and I loved it very much. But um, at the age of 24, I was appointed to my first chief executive's job. Now that was very young, and it was a little baby voluntary organisation in Scotland. And well, of course, me with my workaholism and my big ideas. Within a few years, it became one of the largest organisations in Scotland, and that was a great blessing actually to have a start like that at the age of 24. But I was then a chief executive of different organisations, both in Scotland and throughout the UK and internationally. For about the next 30 years. And of course, by the time I got to the end of 30 years, really I'd been doing it all for a very, very, very long time. For about the last 15 years of my career, Rhino, I suppose what I became interested in was helping companies and organizations that had got themselves into difficulty. And of course, there's no shortage. There's no shortage of them. And one organisation had run up debts of 13 million pounds in 1993, and within 5 years the debt was cleared. But that was a very painful process, and making people redundant and imposing budgets and really hard hands-on management took a huge amount out of me. And then latterly, I got the most wonderful job in the world. So the UK government introduced a national lottery, and they decided that for every £1, 28 pence would go to good causes. And there was no organisation to give out money to charities. So they passed an act of parliament, and they started a new organisation, and I was the first director for Scotland. Now, we had 600 million pounds in the bank to give out, and of course, well, that was just wonderful, but equally demanding in its own way. And all the time the children were born, my two daughters were born, they grew up, and um, um, I was aware that family life had, in some ways, lacked the presence of their dad as often as he could have been there. And, you know, and I think around the late 90s, I began to be aware that really I needed to start to make quite profound changes in my life. I wasn't becoming bored, but I was aware that I was doing the same things 30 years after being appointed chief executive when I was 24. I was
Was
doing
this a gradual moment, or was there a decisive moment where you decided, look, I've got to change something?
um, yes, I think no, I think for me it was a gradual awakening to the fact that I was approaching 50. My life could be different. That was a great watershed for me. I stopped smoking when I was 50, for example. And I began to reflect on this, and I don't know whether you've had this experience, but you start to doodle at your desk. So I started to add up all the positive things in my life and all the negative things. And these were the things that I wanted to change. And then in another column, I started to add up all the money that I had, what I had in the bank, what my house was worth, and so forth. And over time, I came to an agreement with myself, and I don't talk about this very often because it's a kind of deeply spiritual thing, but I made a promise to myself that whenever I had enough money to satisfy my needs, so I wrote down my needs rather than my wants, then I would make the change. And it became increasingly obvious that I was reaching that point, and it would be silly. Anyway, I went to dinner to the chairman of the board's house in Edinburgh. Actually, he lived in Edinburgh, so I flew up to Edinburgh, and he said to me, "Come into the drawing room whilst Jenny is preparing dinner." So I went into the drawing room, and he said, "Look at what Jenny's been up to, John." And there on the wall was what I now know to be a map of the Camino Frances. So there was a map of northern Spain with a red line, you know, he put tape on the map, a line going right across the top of Spain. And there was a picture, 2 or 3 pictures of Jenny with a rucksack on, walking along this red line. And of course, at dinner, she explained that she had walked the Camino Frances in three stages. And the dinner then was taken up by stories of albergues and meeting new friends, of blisters, of great days and wonderful fellowship, and also hard times when it became tough, and the sense of achievement she had. And Graham, her husband went out to Santiago, and they had this massive celebration when the sense of purpose and achievement that she had when she got. Anyway, this of course reawakened a number of things in me. It reawakened my memories of the Scottish hills in my teenage years, and the sense of freedom and fun of that. And you know, we used to sleep in bothies. Bothies are little wooden constructions for hill walkers in the hills of Scotland, just like albergues. A bit more primitive than most albergues. Anyway, all these memories started, but also the prospect of doing something really, really challenging that might be a bridge to a new way of life. And that's what inspired me to then become preoccupied.
And then you took the step. You actually walked. Did you walk the entire route the first time, 2007?
Well, let me tell you, I had been. I'm an organist. I play the church organ. That's been the thing that's been the constant in my life. You know, relationships have come and gone, but I've still been sitting at the church organ, and I had been playing in Seville for several summers, taking a house in Seville. I had a really good time. I've got friends in Seville. I played in a local church with a little pipe organ, very beautiful, very happy. And my plan was to retire and go to Seville and sip chilled sherry under the orange trees, play the organ, have a cold beer, a nice lunch every day. Anyway, I learned about the Via de la Plata. And I had been reading these websites and so forth, and it said the Camino Frances is very busy. So for your first Camino, you're advised to try and find another route. So
just for our listeners, just tell our listeners where the Via de Plata is. Where does it start and where does it end?
It's one of the oldest and most original routes, and it travels all of Spain from the deep south of Spain, from Seville to Santiago. It's about 1,000 kilometers, so it's longer than the Camino Frances. But in my naivety, I didn't know any of this. I didn't know that the Camino Frances wouldn't have been busy in wintertime. I just read this and I said, Seville, I love Seville. I'll be going to Seville anyway, so I'll start walking from Seville. So on the 2nd of January 2007, I set out from Sevilla to walk to Santiago. And in the few days before that, I'd read about the yellow arrows. There are people who don't know about the Camino. There are waymarks, there are signs from the starting point. Every 1,000 meters or so, that point the way for pilgrims. And they're either painted in yellow arrows or they're granites, you know, proper signs. Anyway, I'd gone out a few days before and discovered the yellow arrows were there. And I remember this morning standing outside of the Cathedral of Seville on the 2nd of January, and I looked down at the pavement, and there was the first yellow arrow pointing across the road. And I looked across the road, and there was another yellow arrow pointing to the right. So I crossed the road and I turned right, and I walked along, and there at the next junction was another yellow arrow pointing left down a street. And the truth of the matter is, Rhino, I followed these yellow arrows for 36 days until I reached Santiago. And just outside of Seville, I looked back at the city and I said to myself, this is where you're going to retire to, John. And I kind of said to the city, I'll be back. But of course, what happened was 36 days later, as I walked into the Cathedral of Santiago, everything had changed. Sometimes in sudden moments, other times in very gradually, I realized that I wanted different things in my life, that I wanted to do more walking, I wanted to meet more pilgrims, I wanted more of this experience. It's a very powerful thing that happened to me, because I realized there are good days and bad days, Rhino, you know, and I described one day as a day when I was waving to shepherds in the hills, and there was a day when they never waved back. So there are days which are difficult, but despite the difficult days and the good days, I realized that if I lost everything, you know, these anxieties that go on in your head. If I woke up one morning and there was no money in the bank, if my daughter said, we never want to see you again, Dad, if I lost my house and became a homeless person, if the people who love me just said, we don't like you anymore, if I had nothing in my life, then actually I could pack a rucksack and be free and still have adventures and walk. And the sense of empowerment, it's actually like empowerment that gave me, it freed me from many of the anxieties which had fueled my workaholism and my perfectionism for many years. And so when I walked into the Cathedral of Santiago at the age of whatever I was, 53, 54, I had done it. I'd done it physically, and I had changed in terms of my own view of myself and my place in the world. And I very quickly realized that Santiago was to be the place. Santiago in the rain was to be the place rather than Seville in the sun. So that's the way it's become.
Wow. I just want to come back to one of your books with the title, It's About Time, A Call to the Camino de Santiago. What message did you want to put across with that book? Because I think it fits very well with your story you just told us here.
Well, God, the books. Well, what I set out, I didn't really set out to do. I set out to write a book which was to be the collection of many of my stories and encounters on the Caminos. But I also realized that what's the old saying? When the pupil is ready, the master comes. When the pupil is ready, the teacher comes. And that was the story of me and the Camino. That it was at that point in my life where I was ready to make changes that I discovered the Camino to Santiago. And in many ways, it was the bridge, it was the vehicle for very profound changes in my life, geographical changes, but also a complete change in lifestyle. And I realized that for me, it's time that you do this. And I also wanted to suggest to other people that we go through this process of the seed being planted about change and about walking the Camino as the great symbol of the rite of passage from one life to another life. And for all of us, it can be about time.
The interesting thing is that so many people have told me that the Camino is an analogy of life. It puts things into perspective. Suddenly, the things you thought were important are no longer important. All that is important is the moment, having your backpack and enough to
Absolutely.
eat and drink and to
Hmm.
find a place to sleep, and walking these ancient trails that have been walked by pilgrims many hundreds of years. That does something to you inside. It changes something. It's this magical um, uh, thing about the Camino that is so different to just walking a normal hiking trail.
Aye. Well, you see, I would go one step further and say it's actually a reenactment of the process of our life. With life, we're born, we journey through all of the vicissitudes, we overcome the difficulties, we meet the challenges, and then we die. And in many ways, walking a Camino is like walking through your life. Because we start and we've got great hopes and expectations, and there are challenges, but there are huge joys and benefits. But of course, the journey comes to an end. And so, in many ways, I think for me, it was the realization at a very profound level that I'm mortal and that all of my striving wasn't going to change the fact that I'm mortal. And one day I will not be here. And my life is no more than dropping a stone in the pond, and the ripples go out, and the ripples can be to the good of the world, or they can be to the bad of the world. And that's my decision. And I think these are the decisions we make about how the course of our life will go. And I decided that I wanted to spend more time walking. I wanted to, the Confraternity of St. James in London, just later that first year, said to me, if you're thinking of walking another route, go on the Camino Inglés, and we need a guidebook. And of course, rising to the challenge as ever, I walked the Camino Inglés, wrote my first guidebook, and we're now 16 books later, right? that became another obsession. But I'm very happy.
So that was the turning point at a stage where you decided, look, this is my destiny, this is my mission, this is what I want to do. Did that process ripen on that very first Camino?
I think for me, it's about giving up control. For me, it was about taking my hands off the steering wheel and going along with what was happening. Let me tell you just very quickly what happened. In that first year, after walking the Camino, I walked the Camino Inglés, and then later on in late November, I walked the Camino Frances. So 3 Caminos in 1 year. I was up to something, trying to change something. But then I volunteered in the Pilgrim's office, and I was the first volunteer in amongst the paid staff writing Compostelas. And I thought this was wonderful, welcoming pilgrims at the end of their journey, and you could see the joy in their face, the excitement in their face, the parents who walked with children who described it as a unique experience to spend, a daughter spending time with her mum, walking for a month, and so forth. Anyway, one day, one of the lads in the office, he's called Danny Vargas, who's my best friend here in Santiago. He said to me, John, you're coming out to Santiago all the time and working with us, and we like you very much, but this is costing you a fortune, staying in hostels and so forth. And he said, we have an apartment in our family that we don't use. My partner's grandmother died, left the apartment to her mother. Her mother renovated the apartment, lived in it, and then she died, and it's just sitting there. So he said, you can have it. And so we went to visit this apartment, and I agreed a rent and all the rest of it. But we went up to the 4th floor of this building, and he opened the door, and here was an apartment. It was like the Marie Celeste. They had just closed the door after the mother had died. It was fully furnished, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, looking at the spires of the cathedral over the rooftops. And I thought, what I've got to do is just go along with this. All of the arrows were pointing in the same direction. John, just go along with it. And so I rented that apartment. I started spending more time here. Eventually, I decided to move about 10 years ago, and the rest is history. So for me, Rhino, I mean, I very rarely would go along with anything in the past. I wanted to know exactly what the measurable outcomes would be
Yeah.
on the business plan of my life. And so
Yeah, you just mentioned this experience of looking into those faces of pilgrims coming into the pilgrim's office in Santiago.
hmm.
What is one of your most memorable experiences
Oh, for
with fellow
heavens.
pilgrims,
With arriving pilgrims.
or with a fellow pilgrim on the way?
No, one of the most memorable experiences was a very perjinct, do you know that word, perjinct? a perjinct, a perjinct couple. They were dainty, but very beautifully dressed, meticulously dressed pilgrims who arrived in Santiago, French pilgrims. And I got chatting to them. They spoke some Spanish, which is unusual for French people. Anyway, they were chatting away, and it was their 11th pilgrimage. And I said to them, all of these pilgrimages from different places, and they described the story of their daughter, who had died at the age of 11 in very tragic circumstances. They were an older couple, and they'd had this baby late in life, and she was the apple of their eye, and she
Mhm.
died. And they started walking the Camino in her memory, and this was the 11th Camino on the 11th anniversary of her death. And a tear just trickled down the woman's face, and she said, "And now we're finished." And I thought, they have, the Camino has been a huge blessing to them, because they've been able to, it took 11 years, it took 11 Caminos for them to achieve closure of this terrible event in their life. And I go back to that, my first time on the Camino Frances, when I was walking up to the to the Iron Cross, and it's kind of up a hill, and here on the side of the path was this German man. He was a big guy, and anyway, I helped him up, and he had terrible blisters, and he had too many things, Rhino. You've seen all of this, a gigantic
Yeah,
rucksack.
yeah.
And he had a pair of boots on, and hanging onto his rucksack was an even heavier pair of boots. And because he didn't know what to bring, so he packed everything, hence the blisters. But as we walked along over that day and the following day, he explained that he had been a businessman, and he was a businessman, and he'd started taking cocaine to keep him going. And this became a secret addiction that no one knew about. But he was determined to break it. And so he decided to walk the Camino. Well, his blisters became so bad that I left him, I think in Puente La Reina. I can't remember exactly where. And I've often wondered about that man, and if he made it, if he made the changes at that point, or was he beginning the process of change, and he would revisit the Camino, and whatever happened to him, I don't know. But he shared his story with me, which was a great privilege. So
Wow.
there's two stories out of thousands.
Out of thousands, yes. Uh, the thing about the Camino is that when I first walked, that this was even before the year 2000, it was mainly people who had retired in their late 50s, and now my last walk, 2019, I noticed so many more younger people, more Eastern Europeans, more Asians. It's
Yes.
become more international, and there is something happening on a global level, on a collective level, I think, um, where the Camino has become a symbol of something. Um, and the figures are amazing. I mean, 300, over 300,000 in 2019 who walked the Camino. And I think it had certainly reached a point where it had become very crowded on some routes. Um, So where do you think the Camino is going in the future now after the pandemic has reduced the numbers to about, what is it, 53,000 last year?
Just a trickle.
It's a
Yeah.
trickle from what it was. But obviously
Well,
there is still that deep need of many people to a deep spiritual need, which the Camino is fulfilling for many people.
well, we were predicting 500,000 would arrive in this holy year before the pandemic brought a halt to everything. Now, um, there are various predictions around, and I tend not to get engaged in predictions because often they don't come true. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that not only will the Camino survive, but it will flourish very quickly again. Now, I think it might take a little time um, before before the big numbers start to come back. We will have people walking later this year. Certainly, Spaniards will walk as soon as the as soon as the restrictions are lifted in May. I need to go and visit friends in other parts of Spain. I need to go back to Malaga and see people and sort some things out there. So movement will start and people will start walking the Camino. Next year will be much busier. They're saying maybe we'll get to 70 or 80% of the numbers expected in 2022. Who knows? I think it might take a little time because people, people have not seen their grandchildren for a year. People have not seen other relatives. And we've all sat here feeling frightened by this pandemic going throughout the world. We've come to realize the value we place on family and friends and loved ones. And people will want to reestablish physical
Now,
contact
you
with.
did an amazing thing. You actually walked the Camino during the pandemic. You walked it for others who couldn't walk the Camino.
Well,
Tell us a bit about that experience.
walking for other people is deep in the traditions of the Camino to Santiago, of asking people what they want prayed for, what they want reflected on, and to bring these on the journey to Santiago. And I'm living here in Spain, and there was a period where there were no restrictions apart from social distancing, washing your hands, and so forth. And I decided that it was a huge opportunity to experience the Camino Frances with few pilgrims. And it also gave me the opportunity to say to people, and I had long suspected that if we said to people, send us your hopes and prayers and fears, the things you want other people to join with you in praying about and in hoping for. Well, 400 people wrote to me, and
Wow. Yeah.
yes,
Amazing.
many deeply intimate and personal things were in these emails, and it was very humbling actually. And anyway, I walked the Camino Frances. I met people who will be friends for life, young people.
And this
Out.
was the summer of last year?
It was it was late September and October of last year. I had been I had been walking 3 Caminos last year. I had been walking the Via de la Plata again. And I walked into Merida with a friend of mine on the 14th of March, just as the state of alarm was declared for the first time, and everything had to be abandoned. And I had to hot foot it as quickly as possible back to Santiago. And of course, then in Spain, we were locked in our houses. We were under house arrest
I
for
know.
just over 2 months. Well, at least you were in the good weather in Mallorca, right?
Indeed. But
Right.
I know all about it. I mean, it was just what an experience. I mean, all we could do was go to the next supermarket and back.
Yes.
That was it.
A very difficult time for everyone. So when all of that eased up, and there were no restrictions apart from being extremely careful and keeping your distance from other people, and I decided to walk the Camino Frances, and it was a really wonderful experience. And the thing that really impressed me were the meticulous preparations in albergues and in hotels and in hostels. And of course, there hasn't been one reported case of community transmission of the virus from groups of pilgrims. There was one reported case of the virus being transmitted within a group of Spanish pilgrims, but none in local communities. And I just think that's commendable.
I've been wondering about these big albergs. I was a hospitaliero in the municipal alberg in Najera with 100 beds. Uh, Obviously, this won't be happening in future or in the near future. Uh, where do you see this going? I mean, obviously, we won't have those masses of people staying in one alberg. Uh, it's just not possible.
Well, I think churches are the thing to look at, Rhino, in my in my view, because churches in Spain have been open. Now, the church where I play the organ here in Santiago is a really good example, because we operate at 50% capacity. That's the government regulation, and everyone has to be at least 2 meters apart. So there are pews closed, and everyone's got to be spread out. Everyone's got to wear a mask all of the time. So there are procedures for this, that, and the next thing. In the same way as in the albergues at the moment, those albergues which are open, they're operating at 50% capacity. So if it's a room of bunk beds, if you can imagine this, if the bottom bunk bed is being used, then diagonally opposite, the top bunk is used. So everything's spread out and capacity has been reduced. Now, of course, this will have a significant economic effect on the operation of albergues along the community, and it's yet to be seen what that effect will have. And of course, we don't know, as more and more people become vaccinated in Spain, when the regulations will be eased and the capacity of places can move up. Have you been vaccinated yet?
I have got my first shot.
Well, does that mean you're older than me?
I'm 63.
Now, I'm 68, and there's no sign of me being vaccinated. And I have friends in their mid-70s not vaccinated. So it's operating at a different speed in different parts of Spain.
Different parts of Spain, definitely. So coming back to the albergs, Johnny, the one of the precious things about the Camino is the sharing of experience in the evening in the alberg, sharing stories and interacting with fellow pilgrims. Now, this won't be possible in that form anymore. Or where do you see this going?
Well, I'm not as depressed as that. We had communal meals with other pilgrims in restaurants in October and September. Now, we were all sitting apart. At the moment, only 4 people can sit at a table. So yes, things are different for the moment, but I have no doubt, Rhino, that we will see in May, when there will be more relaxation of the restrictions, we think, and then increasingly as the population becomes vaccinated and people coming from outside Spain into Spain become vaccinated, then I do think there will be a great easing of restrictions. I wouldn't say never will we be able to all get into the kitchen and cook pasta and then sit around the table with bottles of very cheap wine, but very good, but high quality, low quality.
Obviously,
wine,
have
low quality. Sorry,
yeah.
right? Low quality wine and high quality fellowship.
Yeah, but you obviously have many friends in the who run private albergs as well. They must have been going through a very difficult time during the lockdown. I mean, they are dependent on pilgrims coming and staying overnight, buying food and wine, and obviously some are going through a very difficult time. Are they being supported in some way? Is the confraternity giving them some support? What's happening in that direction?
Well, the government of Spain has been providing some support, and but not much. The scale of the economic effects of this pandemic here in Spain and on the Camino are incredible. I mean, just profound. I spoke to many people, and I've got many friends who have albergues along the Camino, along many of the Camino routes, the Camino Portuguese. I was talking to somebody the other day. I think one of the sad things, Rhino, is that people, in the expectation of the Holy Year, when we thought numbers would go to 500,000, some people borrowed money to expand their facilities, to renovate albergues and so forth. And, you know, as somebody said to me, the stark reality is many albergues are owned by people outright. Families had the building, they converted the building years ago. But other people, if somebody has a bank loan, then they may be in great difficulty. The banks are being sympathetic for the moment. But of course, the mortgage will have to be paid at some point. And one hostel owner who also has an albergue said to me, John, we do not have a word to describe this. If you take the Spanish word for catastrophe and add it to the Spanish word for disaster and multiply it by 100, you may be approximately reaching the scale of this thing. And so we wait and see the fallout from the pandemic economically in Spain and in many other countries. But in Spain, with its already fragile economy, will be very significant indeed.
I think really we haven't seen the full effects of this yet, but all the more we do wish that things will start picking up very soon, and that we'll have at least more pilgrims than last year. Um, what would you, in summing up, tell people who've always had the Camino on their bucket list? And haven't had the courage to walk it. What advice would you give these people?
Well, what I say to them is, it's about time that you packed your rucksack, did some training at home, buy your tickets to Spain and start walking. And that's all you need to do. Listen, trust me. All you need to do is have your stuff with you, get here to Spain, find the first arrow on whatever route. If you're walking in Portugal, you've got to start in Lisbon or in Oporto outside the cathedral, the Via de la Plata in Seville, the Camino Frances from Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, or anywhere along the route. Find the first arrow, follow the direction, and everything else will be revealed.